It was Jerry Adams, the Sinn Féin leader, who said, "Making peace, I have found, is much harder than making war." Peace is often thought of as something passive. Peace and quiet, stillness. But in the words of Jesus, it becomes something active. We are called to be peacemakers. 100 years ago, in March 1916, the Military Service Act introduced compulsory military conscription for the first time in our country's history. Some felt that to make peace, we first had to make war. Others felt that to follow Jesus, they had to take a stand against war. It was actually the first time that the church and individual Christians had to face this ethical dilemma. They were called to count the cost of being a disciple. Apart from the Quakers, all the mainstream churches chose to support military service. Even the primitive Methodist Church, which until the outbreak of war had been largely a pacifist church. This meant that many individual Christians were left feeling confused and betrayed, as this letter reveals. Sir, when one considers the attitude of the church to the conscientious objector, it seems so inconsistent and very perplexing. Perhaps it is easier to go into the trench than face the scorn and sneers that many have had to endure for conscience sake, from those who ought to have given sympathy. A friend of mine told me that at heart he was a conscientious objector, but was too much of a coward to face its consequences. The consequences were lifelong. Dick Ellis said of his father Hiram, "He was hamstrung all his life by having been a conscientious objector in the First World War. He was blackmailed, you see. He didn't have a vote. He lost all civil rights until 1928. Couldn't hold a legal position. Couldn't be a trustee of the church. He had a black mark against him all his life, but he was not bitter about it." Why did the churches support the war? Their overriding principle was loyalty to the state, a belief that patriotism was a Christian virtue. As the Wesleyan Methodist president, Dinsdale Young, put it, "Love of country is part of the love of God." How do we respond to that? How did the church in Germany respond to Hitler? Is this a challenge for us, for the church in Britain today? So on what grounds did others, for conscience sake, refuse to fight? Well, for some, it was a belief in the Bible teaching they had had in Sunday school. Albert Spencer from Ilkeston told the Military Service Tribunal that he had been brought up in a Christian home and belonged to a primitive Methodist Bible class and could not kill anyone. Their response was to call him a coward. His appeal was rejected. For others, it was about discipleship. It was about following Jesus. As one said, I cannot see Jesus carrying a bayonet or a gun. For Albert Victor Murray, president of the student Christian movement at Oxford University, it was a question of which authority he should obey. Render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's, he told the tribunal. Wise or foolish, I can but be loyal to that conviction which lies deepest within me. My entire attitude to the war comes to this, that with respect to authority, I must obey the call of Christ as it comes to me. There were 16,000 conscientious objectors in the First World War. 6,000 of them went to prison for their beliefs as absolutists, and about 80 lost their lives. These men and the women who supported them were pioneers for peace. Their courage helped change attitudes for the future. In the Second World War, there were 60,000 conscientious objectors. One of these was Richard Ellis, a Methodist minister whose father was a conscientious objector in the First World War. He said of his father, "He didn't influence me as a pacifist because the basis of his was different from mine. You see, because in those days it was based on the teaching of Jesus and his example of non-violence and so on, the Ten Commandments, all a simple, straightforward business. But by the time I came to register, the whole basis had changed. My pacifism was based on a particular theology of the cross." For Dick, the cross showed that evil can only be overcome by love. The cross was the divine exhibition of the redemptive nature of suffering love. So what does it all mean for us today? There are still choices to be made. Rex Brindle, a Methodist local preacher, a conscientious objector in World War II, and the father of Heather Bates, who's here today, wrote after the war, "How anyone can look up with raised hands and closed eyes and heavenly expression and sing, 'Take my hands and let them move at the impulse of thy love,' and then go back to the factory floor and make nuclear bombs is beyond me." There are still courageous choices of conscience to be made today. Daniel Woodhouse, a Methodist minister, was arrested in 2013 for taking part in a non-violent protest at an arms fair. Modern warfare includes the use of drones to bomb targets thousands of miles away. It's even harder to see the victims as human beings than it was in 1917, when this was the experience of a soldier as told to a Methodist chaplain. I was behind my gun, watching my shells falling into the enemy's camp. In the distance, I watched men fall, and a great exultation came for a moment into my heart. I thought, there they go. I'm doing my share in ridding the earth of these vermin. Yet as I was firing, my mind seemed to be divided into two. For while I was engaged in this deadly work of firing, I suddenly saw myself on the platform of a concert hall or in a church, singing from Elijah and the Messiah. I could even see my audiences and hear their applause, and also hear the sound of my own voice singing out the sacred words. Then in a moment, the contrast between that and this burst upon me, and it seemed as if I were talking to myself and saying, how can you, who sang these words and who would sing them again tomorrow if you had the opportunity, how can you stand behind this gun and send its deadly shells among your fellow creatures, who for the moment are your enemies, but who are nevertheless the sons of mothers like your own and the children of a common Heavenly Father? What does it mean for us to be peacemakers today? It means working for just and peaceful relationships wherever we are, in our work, in our homes. Sometimes that might be the most difficult place of all. And in our church. It means listening with respect to those who hold contrary convictions. It means engaging in politics to find alternative ways to break vicious cycles of hostility and fear. It means working globally to combat economic and social threats to peace, such as poverty and climate change. It is not an easy task. We honour those who walked the road before us, who had the courage to follow their conscience, who were persecuted and imprisoned, showing us the true cost of discipleship. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God.